Hey, my name is Ben from the Benjamin Sahlstrom YouTube channel. In this course, we're going to be talking about how to prepare for an electrical outage and also calculate the size of backup system that you're going to need for an outage that lasts 3 hours, 3 days, or even up to 3 weeks. So the first thing that we have to discuss is how much wattage, how much power do we actually need during an outage. And that's going to really change depending on where you're located and what types of essential devices are required in your house. So we're going to use my place as an example, and we're going to be focusing mostly on the essentials. Now, keep in mind that you can expand this as much as you want to. If you want to be able to run the entire house and have grid-like power, then you're going to have to buy a pretty big system. But for most people, this is definitely going to be more realistic. So let's talk about the most essential thing, and I think that's going to be your refrigerators and freezers. Keeping your food from spoiling is really important in an outage scenario. Now, thankfully, it doesn't actually take very much power at all to run a refrigerator. In fact, my refrigerator right over there is running right now, and it's only drawing 108 watts while it's operating. Now, it will spike once in a while beyond that because, believe it or not, most refrigerators and frost-free freezers have a heater inside of them for going through a defrost cycle. So when that happens, the wattage is going to bump up to probably closer to 800 watts, but most of the time it's going to be closer to 100 or 150. So for me, I have a few other freezers outside, so I'm going to assume my total wattage that I need for that category is 800 watts. Another very essential thing is communication devices. So we're talking things like cell phones and maybe even your internet modem. Depending on where you're at, you might want walkie-talkies. All that stuff is pretty low draw, so we're going to talk probably only 100 watts is what we would need to get by with for those items. Now, lighting is also important, but thankfully with LEDs, the chances of you needing more than 100 watts are basically zero. So we're going to put 100 watts down for lighting. Anker is actually putting together certificates for those of you who complete this course, as well as giving away some prizes. So there's going to be questions related to the content that we're going through right now, so feel free to check that out. Now, depending on where you are, it's either going to be hot or it's going to be cold or it's going to be super nice. Where we live, it is really cold. We're in the northern part of the United States, so if an outage were to happen in the winter, we would need to run some sort of heating. And for us, we use a forced air gas furnace, which doesn't take a lot of power for the heating itself, but it does have to move the air through the house. And that's going to take, on average, about 800 watts for that furnace fan to push the air through the house. So 800 watts continuous is what we'll assume for our heating load. Now, if you have an electric furnace or if you're relying on heat pumps to keep your house warm, that's going to take a lot more energy. You're probably going to have to start talking in the thousands of watts, 2,000-3,000 watts to be able to run those. And that's going to be really difficult in a longer outage unless you have a very substantial system. So I'm going to assume 800 watts for our gas furnace. And then if you were in a really hot area, you might want to consider adding a window AC unit at about 1500 watts. That should be able to allow you to cool down maybe one small area of your house, but not the entire thing. 1500 watts is enough to run pretty much all of your plug-in cooking appliances. Think toasters, toaster ovens, griddles, even just like a little hot plate that you can use to cook some stuff on. Those items all usually use 1500 watts or less. Now, if you want to run your main stove, in my case, it's a gas stove, so it uses basically zero electricity. But if you have an electric one, those are usually going to be 240 volts, which it's going to be a little bit tougher to run that. So I usually recommend having some kind of an alternate way to cook. I also have a gas grill and griddle outside. Those can work really good in an outage scenario too if I don't have the ability to run my 240 volt oven. Although I will mention that if you do have a 240 volt power source, you probably can run one of the small burners on that. It's probably not going to be a lot more than 1500 to 2000 watts for just a single small burner. So that might be an option assuming you do choose a 240 volt load. And that brings me to my next item, which is pumps. For my house, pumps are essential, especially when it comes to fresh water. We have a pump, I think it's about 150 feet down, right back over there in the yard, and if that doesn't run, we don't have water, and it requires 240 volts. So having a 240 volt power source is pretty much essential for me. It looks like my well pump uses about 425 watts when it's running. The other pumps that I have to keep in mind are my sump pump, which doesn't run very often for me, but if I were to need it, and oftentimes power outages can occur during flooding, it would be important to be able to run that, as well as my septic pump. So I'm going to say 1,000 watts for my pumps, and that should be adequate. Now, as far as other optional loads go, if we want to talk about your electric dryer, a gas dryer would actually be pretty easy to run on a backup system, but an electric dryer draws quite a bit. It's a 30 amp, 240 volt connection to that unit, so that can put a pretty big strain on your backup energy system. We're talking 3,000 watts plus. Another thing would be a resistance electric water heater. So a standard tank type water heater is going to draw probably 4,400 watts when that thing is running. That's also a pretty massive load that you can most likely get by without. Although some of the systems I'm going to talk about, actually the one I'm going to recommend, can handle that as long as you were able to run it intermittently and have a good way to recharge your system, because 4,400 watts will drain your batteries so fast. Another thing that's actually pretty easy to run during an outage is a tankless water heater. If you are fortunate enough to have a tankless gas water heater, those don't require very much power at all, so it'd be a good way to have hot water during an outage would be a tankless gas water heater. So taking those numbers that I just said, if we add all of those up, it comes to about 4,500 watts that I would like to be able to operate and potentially operate simultaneously. Now, if you take into account how much your house actually uses on average, it's not nearly as much as you would think. In fact, right now at my place, we are currently drawing 1,600 watts approximately. So even though all those things that we added up came to 4,500 watts, a lot of the time you're not going to use that much. And that leads us into part 2 of the course, and that's going to be estimating the voltage and size of the backup system that you choose to use for your setup. Now, it's really important to talk about intermittent loads versus continuous loads, and we already talked about that a little bit, but just know that if you are strategic in rotating which appliances and devices you're using, you can likely get by with a much smaller system. If you want everything to potentially be able to operate at the same time, you're going to have to buy something that's a little bit larger. Another important thing to distinguish is running wattage versus surge wattage or inrush current. And that really comes into play when you're talking about large inductive loads or large electric motors. The most common one that people are going to encounter are going to be compressors located inside of air conditioners. So even window units require quite a bit more inrush current. So for example, I had a 4,800 watt peak generator, and it was not able to run my air conditioner even though it draws less than 2,000 watts when it's running. And that's just because it requires so many amps to get that compressor to go that I was unable to start it. However, the battery stations that I have now mostly can start that unit, and that's because of the really good surge wattage capability that they have. So running wattage is the cumulative total of what things take once they've started, versus startup wattage or inrush current is the amount of energy that it takes to get something started initially. If you're trying to figure out how much wattage your devices require, there's a couple cool ways to do it. One, you can buy a little device that plugs into the wall that you plug in your appliance to, and that will tell you your real-time wattage. Or you can just look at the rating on the appliance, but sometimes that's a little bit above what your real-time running watts might be. Like on your refrigerator, it's going to show you a much higher number than what it actually operates at most of the time because of that heater. Now we're going to talk about voltage and power quality. As I already mentioned, I have a well pump that is 240 volts, so right away I have to choose a 240 volt power source in order to accommodate that, but there's actually a lot of good benefits for choosing a 240 volt source. So unless you have just a few essential things that you need to power that are 120, I would recommend leaning towards a 240 volt power source. For the versatility of it, the things that you can operate that you wouldn't be able to otherwise, as well as the connection method to the house, which we're going to talk about in a second. But 240 volts is the way that I would go in my situation, but you might be able to get by with 120. Just look at that list of appliances and make sure there's not something on there that's 240 that you would like to run. For power quality, there's really one main thing to keep in mind, and that is that a standard gas generator outputs pretty dirty power. And by dirty power, I mean the sine wave, the 60 hertz sine wave that makes or outputs is oftentimes not very regular. And that's why using a pure sine wave inverter is going to be way better for running your sensitive electronics. You're going to be a lot less likely to see lights flickering. Like, I have a pretty new gas generator, and when I power the house, like, the lights flicker in here, and it's just not nice. Now, if you are going to run a gas generator, your best option is to run it at about 50% load. Let's call it 40 to 60% load, or maybe even up to 70, in order to get the cleanest sine wave. If you start pushing them up to the maximum running wattage, your power starts to fall apart a little bit, as well as on the lower end, if you're just running a really small amount of power, the sine wave is going to be not very good. An inverter gas generator, though, should do much better when it comes to the power quality category. So I need 4,500 watts potentially of continuous output in order to power the things I want to power, and 240 volts. So my specific recommendation for that meets those really nicely is going to be the Anker SOLIX F3800 Plus. With that unit, we have up to 6,000 watts of continuous output and surge well above that. So I can actually start my regular central air conditioner with no soft start. It fires right up on a single F3800 Plus, which is pretty amazing. The other nice thing is we have a lot of good ways to recharge that system with solar inputs, as well as the ability to recharge it with the gas generator. With that being said, I do think that it's also very essential to have a gas generator to recharge that unit. Now I want to talk about connection method. So once you've chosen your power source or your backup power system, you have to decide, how am I going to actually connect that to the house? And there's three main ways of doing it. The first one, and probably most common, is going to be using extension cords. And if you're going to use extension cords, I have a couple of things that you should keep in mind. The first of which is to use heavier cords. Don't use the cheapest cords, because they're oftentimes going to be 16 or 18 gauge, really tiny wires. It's probably the #1 cause of fires, is using extension cords that are too small. So use at least a 12 gauge extension cord, if not even a 10 gauge. If you're running a longer cord, a 10 gauge cord might be a good option, but 12 gauge at a minimum for 120 volt loads that you're going to be using with extension cords. So definitely works, but is not preferable if at all possible. The second connection method is going to be using a generator inlet box, which is probably one of my favorite ways of powering a property, because you can power everything downstream of that inlet box. Some people have a generator inlet that's actually connected to certain circuits that can turn on and off. So if you have that, that can work too, but you might not be able to power the entire place. But with mine, I can plug it in outside and power every single thing on the entire place, albeit not simultaneously. And that's why when you do connect with a generator inlet box, you always want to turn off all of the breakers in your panels before you turn on your backup power supply. That interlocked breaker system prevents you from backfeeding the grid, but then you can just turn on your individual loads that are essential, and you can also cycle them too. You can turn off the ones you're not using and then turn on the ones that you need. That's a really good way of doing it. Now the third and nicest way of connecting your backup system to your house is something that's automated. When the power goes out, the system is going to realize it and automatically switch over to backup battery power. And typically it can do it in just a fraction of a second. So the lights are just gonna just barely go on and off, or off and on. So that's pretty impressive and definitely the most convenient way of connecting your backup power. Now we're going to talk about 3 hours, 3 days, and 3 weeks when it comes to handling an outage. So the 3-hour outage is obviously more of an ankle biter. It's inconvenient, but you don't have to do a whole lot in order to make it through that outage. In fact, if it happens during the night, you might not even know about it unless somebody tells you, or you have an old-fashioned clock that lost track of time. But with a 3-hour outage, the important things to keep in mind are try not to open your refrigerator if at all possible. If you leave it closed, then it's going to hold temperature fine for that short duration of time. And then you can, for your basic things, get a small portable power station for keeping your cell phones charged and those basic essentials during that 3-hour outage. You could even connect a sump pump or your refrigerator or even a small cooking appliance to that. It can output like 1800 watts or something like that. Now moving on to our 3-day outage, now things start to get a little bit more serious. Even if you leave the doors on your freezers and your refrigerators closed, they are going to start to melt down and your food is going to spoil if you go beyond several hours, probably 24 hours before your freezers really start to have an issue. So what it really matters for those longer outages is having your backup system, but having a way to keep it running. So if you're running on gas, obviously you need to have plenty of gas around, or propane. I much prefer dual fuel generators to just gasoline ones. Or if you're using a battery system, understand how many kilowatt hours you have, but ultimately you're going to have a way to recharge your backup battery system. And there's 2 ways of doing that. You can either use solar panels, portable solar panels, or even some rigid ones that you can temporarily install outside. But if it's cloudy, you probably are going to have to go back to using a gas generator to recharge that battery system. And that's one of the best methods of using a battery like that, is the fact that you can power up your battery system to recharge it with a gas generator if necessary, and then shut off the gas generator and just operate off of the silent power station while it drains down. Then you do the same thing again if you need to. But solar panels are really the most convenient way, assuming you have good weather. Now moving on to the 3-week outage, and this is where I want to talk a little bit more about just planning your strategy for the future. If you do think that you will encounter a 3-week outage, I would highly recommend installing some solar panels. I just installed 12 rigid solar panels, and those will be able to connect into my F3800 Plus and keep us going in a longer term outage, at least with the essential items. And it's just so convenient to not have to go try to find fuel for the generator or for the backup power system. So installing some permanent rigid solar panels, I think, is a really good strategy. And then the other thing you could do too is just look at moving some of your essential circuits into a backed up panel so that it's really easy to choose which circuits are going to be powered during that longer outage. Now, when it comes to if it were the winter, so if it happened in January and it was like a week of really bad wintry weather, the solar panels are going to do us no good. So what we have is a propane tank that heats our house, but can also run our gas generator, and that would be able to function quite well with recharging the F3800 Plus, running off of that, and then recharging it again as necessary. Now that we made it through the outages, let's talk a little bit about your battery and backup systems when you're not using them. So a few tips when it comes to gas generators are try not to use ethanol fuel. Using that stuff in your unit is just going to cause the gas tank and the carburetor to get all gunked up. So use non-ethanol fuel whenever possible, and if you can't, use some kind of a stable product or a seafoam kind of thing where you can stabilize that fuel so that hopefully it doesn't go bad in the carburetor and cause your unit to not work without having to pull the carburetor apart. The second thing you should do is just start it once every 3 months. Start your generator, let it run for a few minutes, plug something in if you want. That is going to cycle new gas through the carburetor and keep it so that it's ready to go, especially if it's non-ethanol gas. Personally, if I use non-ethanol gas in my stuff, I can come back and start it a year later without ever using it in between, and it's fine. Obviously, change your oil once a year or follow whatever manufacturer recommendations for your gas generator are, and then make sure that you have plenty of fuel on hand. Now for battery systems, you're going to want to make sure that you recharge the batteries to 100% every 3 months or every 90 days. And that's really going to protect those batteries from significant degradation were they to drop really low. That's the number one thing to avoid is if you fully discharge a battery and leave it at 0, it's absolutely going to destroy it. So it's kind of a hard thing to remember too though, because when you do use your portable power station, you use up the power and it shuts itself off. You're like, oh, throw it in the back of the truck and I'll recharge it sometime. No, you need to recharge it as soon as possible because leaving it at 0 is very bad for it. Now some manufacturers recommend discharging to 0 and back up to 100% again every 3 months, and that can be something that you could consider doing, but just always look at the manufacturer's recommendations for whatever power station that you have. Lithium iron phosphate, LFP batteries are totally fine to be charged to 100% and discharged to 0. It's not the same as the older lithium ion battery technology. So calendar aging and degradation of your batteries is more likely to occur than degradation from using it. So just charge and discharge and don't really worry about it too much. Just make sure that you leave it charged after you're done using it. Another thing with battery systems is to make sure that you store them in a good environment. They like to live where we like to live. If you think it feels too hot or too cold, it's probably also too cold or too hot for your batteries in their optimal storage area. Now you can put them in off-season storage that's a little bit hotter or cooler, but just know that they'll last the best if you keep them in a cool, dry place. Now I want to talk a little bit about the other uses for your battery and backup systems. For your gas generator, you're pretty much limited to, like, if you're going to go on a job site, I guess you can bring it with you and start it up and use it there. But with a battery system, there are some cool ways to actually offset some of the cost of the system. In my case, I've got 12 solar panels, and those are going to just continuously offset, as much as they produce, the electricity that is used on this property. And over time, that will help to reduce the amount of money that had to be spent on that backup system. You're never going to see that sort of return on investment when it comes to a gas generator. It can't just produce electricity unless you have gas being dumped into it, obviously. Now that you've completed the course, feel free to click on that button right at the top of the description to go take the quiz related to this and get your certificate if you're interested, and check out the possible prizes that you can enter for. I'll also put any other useful links that I'm able to down in the description. Thanks so much to Anker for helping us create this mini course, and we'll talk to you guys in the next one.